Corlys Velaryon is one of the most important characters in House of the Dragon. Without him and his pursuit of power, his ambition, the dance may never have happened, and yet it has already cost him almost everything. The episode opens with Corlys approaching an empty driftwood throne, his wife now dead, his son he believes dead, his daughter Laena dead, and what for, he asks. The Velaryons are arguably the wealthiest family in Westeros, after Corlys brought back incredible riches from his 9 legendary voyages across the world. He sailed to Yi Ti and brought back spices, silk, jade, suggesting there's this country out there that's kind of inspired by China in the same way Westeros is sort of inspired by Europe. He sailed to Ashai, to the Thousand Islands, to Karth, which you saw before in Game of Thrones. Daenerys went there. It was never the battles or big fantastical moments that made Game of Thrones great at its peak. It was always real human characters introspecting and making interesting decisions and facing the consequences of their actions. And this episode is full of moments like that, even if it is a bit slower. Moments like the scene with Corlys before the Driftwood throne. Towards the end of this episode, Baela and Corlys argue over the future of House Velaryon. Baela says that he sailed the world, he gathered all these riches, and it was always, she points out, for Rhaenys, for her, for his love. Corlys is a man of immeasurable ambition. Corlys has done everything a lord could ever hope to do for their house. He has raised his house to be one of the richest and greatest in Westeros. He has raised dragon riders. He has led armies to victory. He has put his blood in the line for the Iron Throne. And yet, it is hard not to see how his ambition, which brought him all of this, is simultaneously costing him everything he loved, supposedly the reason he was doing it for. Marrying Laenor to Rhaenyra led to his son's disappearance. Daemon killed Vaemond for questioning his grandchildren's legitimacy. Standing by Rhaenyra in the dance cost him his wife, his vast fleet now facing the threat of dragons, his wealth on the line to pay for this war. And in this episode, Rhaenyra offers Corlys the position of Hand of the Queen, but Corlys says, "My house is a tomb. Even the death of my wife does not content her. Has she not asked enough of my house?" You all know, in the first season, Corlys made a point to say, history does not remember blood, it remembers names. But how will history remember Corlys Velaryon? As the man who raised his house to one of the greatest in Westeros, or as the man who destroyed it? More than that, in this episode, lost in his grief, Corlys offers Driftmark to Baela as heir, but she rejects him, saying, "I am fire and blood, Driftmark must pass to salt and sea." There's a sad irony to the Dance of Dragons. Corlys has spent his entire life building up the Velaryon name, and now the potential heir doesn't even want it. Will the Velaryons fade into the annals of history? After all, he has known glory after glory, and now it feels like it is just loss after loss in the wake of that. The consequences of everything he has been driven to do. But I do want to point out a really interesting line Baela has in this episode. She says to Corlys, "Rhaenys was not only your wife, a thing to be taken from you." She is calling out Corlys for his kind of possessiveness, his sort of self-centeredness. Rhaenys was her own person with her own judgments and principles and desires and decisions, and she chose to go into that battle with Vhagar because of her convictions. It is not only Corlys's convictions and ambitions which matter here, and he is, in some way, really quite self-centered. He simultaneously wants to exalt his family, but he also treats them as tools to do exactly that, often sacrificing them in that effort. For Corlys to treat Rhaenys like a trophy that Rhaenyra took from him is to disregard Rhaenys as her own person in her decisions. His desire to aggrandize House Velaryon ironically belittles the people in it. After all, if history only remembers surnames, then the first name can be sacrificed for it. Scenes like those between Corlys and Baela, or between Alicent and Aemond this episode in the Small Council, I think are some of the best scenes we have had in this series yet. The dance as a whole is about ambition and others paying the price for it. You've got Daemon and Aemond's ambitions for the throne leading not only to their betrayal, but the deaths of thousands of innocents. You've got Otto's ambitions for House Hightower, Corlys in much the same way, placing others, including children, in the firing line once the dance begins. If the last episode was about people's ambitions, then this episode is about the consequences of ambition. Speaking of, you might be wondering what happened to Sunfire. Aegon's dragon fell out of the sky. It's left a little bit ambiguous in the show. Kristen Cole says that they were long in the dying. I will tell you that in the book, Sunfire's wing is badly damaged, and she's described as crawling around the ashen ruins of Rook's Rest, this great worm feeding on corpses, unable to fly anymore. Now, the conflict is getting a little complicated, and last episode I took you through kind of a map of where people and things are. I'm going to do that again and then update it with stuff that's happened in this episode. I think that that'll be really helpful to understand where troops are moving, where people are, and why people are where they are. So, Team Black is based on Dragonstone, this little island off the east coast here, as I said. Team Green, based in King's Landing, the capital. The Velaryons have a blockade over the Gullet, this little stretch of water between Driftmark and the land here, which is why people are starting to riot in the capital. King's Landing is very reliant on trade, but they can't get any food in via the water. You've also heard of other dragons around the place. This episode they mentioned Vermithor and Silverwing. You might have heard of Cannibal or Sheep Stealer, and you're wondering, where are they? Well, for the most part, they're on Dragonstone. They're with Team Black, but they don't have riders at the moment. Rhaena Targaryen is up in the Eyrie, up here, securing their army, and you'll notice the Eyrie does look a little bit different to how it did in Game of Thrones. The Lady of the Vale points out that the Eyrie is virtually impregnable, except by dragons. They can descend from the sky, and so needs protection from Team Black. Daemon is at Harrenhal trying to raise an army and bang in his mum, but the Riverlands seem to be rejecting him. Blood and fire and cruelty does not work here. A green army is marching up somewhere from Old Town, and there is possibly Daemon Targaryen with them, who has a beautiful electric blue dragon called Tessarion. We don't really know if they're moving or where they are at the moment, but Otto is returning there. Rhaenyra sends Alinda Massey to King's Landing to stoke that discontent in the population, playing up that starvation, that stress, trying to make it harder for them to control the city. Mysaria reminds Rhaenyra that they are 1,000,000, living in the shadow of the Red Keep and have been forgotten for far too long. The tension is building to something in King's Landing, but to what? In this episode, one of the small folk, Hugh, who we've seen a few times throughout this series, mentions a place called Tumbleton. That is a small town to the southwest of King's Landing. They suggest fleeing to there. Rhaenyra also sends Alfred Broom to Harrenhal to treat with Daemon and ensure their army is being raised. She also, however, sends support and swords to Maidenpool and Crackclaw Point. These are allies in the Crownlands here. Now, why, right? Well, after Kristen's army took Rook's Rest, they fear that the rest of their allies in the Crownlands will fall too, and if they cannot ensure that they are protected, others may not have faith in Rhaenyra. In this episode, however, Jacaerys flies to the Twins. You will know this place better as where the Red Wedding happens later on. Why did they need the Twins? Well, the Twins is basically the only place any large army can cross the Green Fork if they're going between the north and the south. The river is very difficult otherwise to cross, and this gives the Starks, who are heading south from the north, a way directly into the Riverlands to gather the army that they've been trying to build. They're trying to amass an army at Harrenhal. Now, you might remember Robb Stark actually faced a similar problem in a Game of Thrones. He needed to get to Riverrun quickly, and so made that deal at the Twins with the Freys, which turned out, yeah. Now, in the books, we do get a mention of a bunch of other families who are rising up to support Rhaenyra or Aegon, like the Tarleys support Rhaenyra based down at Horn Hill, near the High Towers. But we haven't seen those in the show. I don't know if they're happening or if they're just sort of kind of been written out because there's a lot of little names and people would forget a lot of them. There are a lot of little battles which aren't really shown on screen, and that's probably just done to keep it simple because it would get confusing. But another major theme of this episode is agency, especially female agency. The story has long paralleled Rhaenyra and Alicent's journeys, both exploring female agency in a world like this, but this episode sees that develop in different ways. They kind of diverge. Alicent offers herself up as regent in Aegon's stead, with him being so horrifically injured from the last battle, but the Green Council rejects her. It is a fantastic scene. They're saying, well, it would be kind of weird for us to raise a woman up in our own place, and also you don't have any fighting experience. And she's like, I have ruling experience, basically more than any of you. but they don't want to. Likewise, Rhaenyra laments not only how her council kind of disregards her militarily, but that she was never taught in the first place. Because she's a woman, she talks about how if she was born a boy, then a sword would have been thrust into her hand from a young age. Alicent finds herself increasingly isolated and lacking agency within the Greens, and I've loved what they did to visually and audibly represent that in this episode. After all, Alicent's story in adulthood has always been about trying to reclaim some sense of her agency, sexually with Criston Cole after years with Viserys, after sacrificing her youth to her family's cause, politically on the Green Council, but both of these are slipping through her fingers. There's a really interesting moment later in the episode where Criston Cole calls her by her first name. He calls her Alicent. She says, "I did not give you leave to use my name." She is trying to hold on to whatever control and power she can, not necessarily because she's kind of greedy for it or anything like that, but because she wants a sense of control in her own life, especially now that Otto is gone and Criston is turning away from her. In contrast, Rhaenyra is finding new ways to exert control in this episode. She is frustrated with her council, ignoring ideas, yes, with Daemon pissing her off, yes, and in this episode, Jacaerys takes it into his own hands to go and deal with the Freys without her permission. And yet, she is learning to delegate. You know, this is what Mysaria says. What you cannot do, get others to do. Although this is also kind of a subterfuge thing where it's like, you know, you don't do what you can't be seen to do. She sends an emissary to Harrenhal to take control, to check in on Daemon, saying, "For too long I have relied on him for strength." She makes a move by sending Mysaria's people to King's Landing to stir up the small folk, and instead of giving in to her reckless anger like Aegon did, you know, flying into battle themselves, she sends resources and swords to her allies inland at Maidenpool and otherwise. In a way where Alicent is suffering the isolation of her own choices and the prejudices of others, Rhaenyra is finding new agency within the confines of being a queen. But my favorite detail in this episode easily is in the Green Council meeting, and this is the sort of stuff that I just love to see. When Aemond takes up the sphere of the hand of the king, or the regent, and places it down, it's got this clunk, this weight, this heft, even though he places it down very gently. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the scene in Lord of the Rings where Bilbo tilts the ring and then it hits the ground, and it's hefty, it's weighty. There is this thud, despite it being a small thing. There is weight and consequences and power to this action, and the same can be said of Aemond finally taking the seat at the head of the table. And in the books it reads, by the way, "And so One-Eyed Aemond, the Kinslayer, took up the iron and ruby crown of Aegon the Conqueror. It looks better on me than it ever did on him," the prince proclaimed. What is interesting in this show, I will note, is that it's honestly kind of reversed to the books. Let me explain. In the show, it really feels like the Blacks are losing at this point. I mean, Meleys is dead, they're struggling to build an army, Lucerys is dead, their allies are falling away, Daemon is betraying, the area is skeptical at best, and I mean, the Starks, where the hell are they? But honestly, in the books, it feels like the Greens are really on the back foot at this point. They've lost Harrenhal. This apparently really shook Aegon. They feel like they're losing the Riverlands, the Eyrie, the North. They're blockaded in at King's Landing. The Battle of the Burning Mill kind of wipes out most of their allies in the Riverlands. Otto's plans aren't doing much, and the death of Meleys and Rhaenys is really kind of only the first kind of victory they really have, and it came at the cost of their king and Sunfire, you know? This is undoubtedly a narrative shift on purpose. Like, they know what they're doing. They know how this feels. It feels like the Blacks are on the back foot here. And I don't necessarily know why they're doing it. I have theories. I can't really discuss them without sort of spoiling stuff. Part of me does worry that it's because they want Rhaenyra to sort of be portrayed as the good guy, and the good guy should always be on the back foot, potentially. But I think they're wiser than that. I definitely think George R.R. Martin, who's on the writing team, is wiser than that with this sort of thing. This conflict is a lot more complex than that. It is. I would hope that it's all about making the beats to come more meaningful, and I won't say what those are. However, We did get at the end of the episode a little interesting tidbit. Jace suggests finding new dragon riders for Vermithor and Silverwing, or some of the other dragons. So these dragons, again, they're being kept under Dragonstone. They used to belong to King Jaehaerys and his wife, Queen Alysanne. They're some of the biggest dragons in the world, and they really might be one of the only threats to Vhagar, besides Caraxes, who, as they point out in this episode, cannot be everywhere at once. But I want you to tell me down below, what did you think of this episode? What did you like? What were you a bit more skeptical of? Where do you potentially think it's going? If you haven't read the books, I'm very interested in that. I see some people online saying it's like boring and slow. I personally do not get that criticism. I think that we need more scenes like the one at the Small Council, like with Corlys. I think we need more of that. But let me know down below. Stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.